The first thing that felt wrong wasn't what Daniel said. It was that he wouldn't quite look at me. Every time our eyes almost met, he'd glance at the spreadsheet on the screen instead, as if the numbers were easier to face than his own wife. Around the conference table, people kept pretending to take notes, but nobody was writing anymore. Then he cleared his throat and said, "Some decisions are painful, but leadership isn't about protecting feelings." There was a pause, just long enough for a few people to look at me instead of him. That's when I realized everyone in that room seemed to know what was about to happen, except me. Before I tell you how a man who once promised I would always come before his career ended up firing me in front of an entire hospital, let me welcome you. Welcome to Mr. Hartley's story. To everyone who has supported this channel, thank you for being part of this incredible journey. We're growing every day, improving every day, and bringing you even better content ahead. If you're new here, comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe to officially join the family. People who only knew Daniel Brooks after he became an executive would probably find this hard to believe, but the first time I met him, he spent nearly 10 minutes thanking the volunteers who were clearing coffee cups after a healthcare conference. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. The conference had been held at a downtown Chicago hotel, bringing together physicians, administrators, and healthcare leaders from across the Midwest. The final session had turned into a lively discussion about shrinking hospital budgets, and somehow Daniel and I ended up on opposite sides of the room, arguing over the same question. He folded his conference badge into his jacket pocket and smiled. If a hospital doesn't stay financially healthy, it can't take care of anyone. I crossed my arms. If every decision starts with money, patients become numbers. They shouldn't become numbers, but they do. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel laughed, not because he thought I was wrong, but because he seemed genuinely interested. "I was hoping you'd say something predictable," he admitted. "You've made this harder. Sorry to disappoint you." "I don't think you are." Around us, hotel staff began stacking chairs, a quiet reminder that the conference had ended several minutes earlier. Most people had already left, yet neither of us seemed eager to walk away. Our disagreement drifted into stories about difficult patients, impossible staffing shortages, and the constant struggle to balance compassion with reality. We still didn't agree on everything, but I realized something that surprised me. Daniel listened. Not the polite kind of listening where someone waits for their turn to speak. He actually considered what I said before answering. When we finally reached the lobby, he hesitated. "So," he rubbed the back of his neck, "would it be strange if I asked whether this debate could continue over coffee? I feel like neither of us actually finished." I smiled before I could stop myself. I was thinking the same thing. That coffee lasted nearly 3 hours. The conversation wandered from medicine to childhood memories, favorite neighborhoods, embarrassing first jobs, and why Chicago somehow made winter feel personal. Daniel confessed he'd ruined his first attempt at making pancakes because he thought more batter meant better pancakes. "It looked like the state of Illinois," he said. "I'll need photographic evidence." I burned the evidence. "Convenient." He laughed, shaking his head. "You don't let people win arguments very often, do you?" "Only when they're right." "You've got incredibly high standards." "I've been told." By the time we stepped back onto the sidewalk, evening lights reflected across the river, and neither of us seemed ready to say goodbye. Daniel didn't try to impress me with grand stories or promises about the future. Instead, he asked questions most people skipped. Why had I chosen medicine? What kept me going after difficult days? Which patients stayed with me long after they left the hospital? It wasn't curiosity for the sake of conversation. He cared about the answers. As I drove home that night, I caught myself smiling at red lights like someone remembering a joke. It wasn't because I'd met someone extraordinary. It was because, for the first time in a long while, I'd met someone who made disagreement feel unexpectedly safe, and I had no idea how rare that would turn out to be. Coffee turned into dinner the following weekend. Dinner became long walks through neighborhoods neither of us had a reason to visit, except that we enjoyed discovering them together. Some Fridays ended with sandwiches beside the Chicago River after I finished seeing patients. Other weekends disappeared inside independent bookstores, where we spent more time recommending books to each other than buying them. Nothing about our relationship felt rushed. Neither of us was trying to convince the other we were perfect. Daniel admitted he still worried he wasn't moving fast enough in his career. Promotions had come close more than once, only to land somewhere else. I admitted there were days medicine left me emotionally drained, even when I'd done everything right. Those conversations never felt heavy. They felt honest. One snowy evening, we stood outside my apartment after dinner while flakes settled across Daniel's coat. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said. I looked at him. "That usually sounds expensive." He laughed. "I was actually going to ask if you'd have dinner with my parents next weekend." I pretended to think about it. "Only if you promise not to tell them the pancake story." "No promises." "Daniel, they deserve to know the truth." By the following spring, our families already treated us as though we'd been together much longer than we had. When Daniel proposed, there wasn't a crowd or a photographer hiding nearby. We had spent the afternoon volunteering at a neighborhood health fair. On the walk back to the parking garage, he reached for my hand and stopped halfway across the bridge overlooking the river. "I don't have a speech prepared," he admitted. "You already know I'm terrible at speeches." "I do, but I know how I feel." He looked down for a second before meeting my eyes again. "My life is always better on the days you're in it. I'd like every day to be one of those days." That was it. Simple. Completely Daniel. I said yes, before he'd even finished smiling. Our wedding reflected who we were. A small church, close friends, family, more conversation than dancing, and enough laughter to fill every quiet space. During his vows, Daniel held both my hands so tightly they almost hurt. "I can't promise life will always be easy," he said, his voice unsteady. "But I can promise this. No matter where my career takes me, I never want success to change the man you fell in love with." Several guests smiled. My father nodded. I remember squeezing Daniel's hands because I believed every word. Our first year of marriage wasn't perfect, but it felt balanced. Whoever got home first started dinner. Whoever had the lighter week picked up more of the housework without keeping score. When one of us had a difficult day, the other noticed before being asked. There was one secret I carried, though, not because I wanted distance between us, because I wanted certainty. Twice during that first year, the chairman of the hospital board gently suggested it might be time for Daniel to learn about my family's trust and the ownership it gave me in the hospital. Both times, I declined. "I want him to marry Emma," I told the chairman, "not the woman whose grandfather happened to build a hospital." He smiled kindly. "I hope you never have a reason to regret that choice." At the time, I couldn't imagine why I ever would. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon while I was finishing patient notes. I almost ignored it. Daniel usually texted during work hours, unless something mattered. The moment I answered, I heard him laugh. Not the polite laugh he used with colleagues. The real one. They offered me the job. I leaned back in my chair. For a second, neither of us spoke. "The executive position?" I asked. "I got it." I closed my office door before anyone could see the tears forming in my eyes. "You did it." I kept thinking they'd choose someone with more experience. They chose the right person. That evening, instead of cooking, we picked up takeout from our favorite neighborhood restaurant and spread the containers across the kitchen counter. Daniel talked about everything he wanted to change. "I don't want people to dread walking into work," he said between bites. "There are departments using systems that should have been replaced years ago. Staff waste hours on paperwork that could be automated. And patients? They should feel the difference without even realizing why." I smiled. That sounds like the man I married. For the first few months, it did. Some nights our dining table disappeared beneath reports, staffing charts, and handwritten notes. Daniel asked what physicians struggled with most. I challenged a few of his ideas, and he challenged mine. We didn't always agree, but neither of us tried to win. We were still solving problems together. Then the meetings became longer. The emails never stopped. Consultants arrived with spreadsheets full of recommendations. Board members wanted faster improvements. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same question: what could be reduced? Daniel never brought confidential documents home, but he brought home the pressure. He started checking his phone halfway through dinner. Movies paused because another call couldn't wait. Weekend breakfasts turned into conference calls taken from the study. One evening I reached across the table and rested my hand over his. "You've been somewhere else lately." He looked up, almost surprised I'd spoken. "I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. I know, I just need to get through this first year. Once things settle down, we'll take that trip we've been talking about." I smiled because I wanted to believe him. "I'll hold you to it." "You should." The trip was never booked. Every time one deadline passed, another appeared before we could catch our breath. I kept telling myself this season wouldn't last forever. After all, I'd watched Daniel fight for this opportunity for years. It felt unfair to complain now that he'd finally reached it. So instead of asking for more of his time, I quietly stepped back from full-time clinical work, hoping fewer overnight shifts would mean more evenings together. Daniel hugged me when I told him. "Thank you," he whispered. "I know you're making a sacrifice." "I miss my husband," I said with a smile. He kissed my forehead. "I'm still right here." I believed he meant it. Looking back, I think he believed it too. Neither of us noticed that the distance between us wasn't arriving all at once. It was slipping into our marriage, one ordinary evening at a time. I didn't notice the silence all at once. At first, it sounded like maturity. Daniel came home tired, dropped his keys into the bowl by the front door, kissed my forehead, and asked about my day. It looked normal from the outside. Then his phone would buzz. "Give me 2 minutes." Sometimes it was 5, sometimes 20. By the time he returned to the kitchen, dinner wasn't warm anymore, and whatever I'd been about to tell him didn't seem important enough to bring up again. It happened often enough that I stopped reheating the food, until he actually sat down. One Thursday evening, I had reservations at a small Italian restaurant we'd been trying to visit for months. I wore the blue dress Daniel once said made me look happier than I realized. At 6:30, he called. "I'm so sorry. The board added another meeting. You told me you were leaving by 5. "I know." There was a pause. I could hear several people talking in the background. "Can you give me an hour?" I looked at the dining table where I'd left the reservation card beside my purse. "They'll probably give our table away. I'll make it up to you." "You don't have to make anything up. I'll call when I'm done." He never did. Around 9, I changed into sweatpants, put the leftovers in the refrigerator, and canceled the reservation online. When Daniel finally came home, he looked exhausted. "I'm sorry." "I know." He waited, almost expecting more. It wasn't that I didn't have something to say. I had too much. Instead, I asked whether he wanted me to heat up dinner. He nodded. While the microwave hummed, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't angry. That almost made it worse. A few weeks later, I told him I was stepping away from full-time clinical work for a while. He looked surprised. "I thought you loved practicing." "I do." "Then why?" I smiled because the honest answer felt too vulnerable. "I'd like us to have more evenings together." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I appreciate that more than you know." He meant it. I never doubted that. The problem was that appreciation wasn't the same thing as presence. Days turned into weeks. Every time one deadline ended, another appeared before we'd even talked about the last one. I stopped asking when we'd take the vacation he'd promised. He stopped mentioning it. Neither of us was trying to hurt the other. We simply became very good at pretending everything would get better once life slowed down. Neither of us asked the harder question, what if it never did? A few months later, I decided to go back to work. Not because I needed the paycheck, not because I'd stopped loving the time I'd spent at home. The truth was simpler. I missed the version of myself that existed outside our house. On my first morning back, the hospital looked exactly the way I'd remembered it. The same polished floors, the same volunteers greeting visitors, the same smell of coffee drifting from the cafe near the main lobby. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined how different everything had begun to feel. Then I stepped into the physician's lounge. The conversation stopped, not completely, just long enough for everyone to notice I'd walked in. A resident who used to joke with everyone suddenly became interested in refilling his coffee. 2 department heads lowered their voices until I couldn't hear them anymore. One of the senior nurses gave me a warm hug. "It's good to have you back," she said. "It feels good to be back." She smiled, but it faded almost immediately. "You'll see a few changes." "What kind of changes?" She glanced toward the hallway before answering. "People don't talk as freely anymore." Before I could ask what she meant, someone entered the room, and the conversation shifted to patient schedules. It wasn't until later that afternoon that I began noticing the pattern. Managers rehearsed presentations before meeting with administration. Staff members checked their wording twice before sending emails. Even experienced physicians who had never been intimidated by leadership seemed unusually careful whenever executive meetings were mentioned. The hospital still functioned well. In some ways, it was more efficient than before. Reports were submitted on time. Departments met their targets. Budgets were tighter. Everything looked successful, but something underneath it had changed. Near the end of the day, I saw Daniel walking through the main corridor with several executives. People greeted him respectfully. He greeted every one of them back. From a distance, he looked composed and confident. Yet something caught my attention. No one stopped him to chat anymore. No nurse pulled him aside to celebrate a recovered patient. No technician joked with him the way they once had. The conversations ended the moment he approached. That had never happened before. When he noticed me, his face brightened. "There you are," he said, walking over. "How was your first day back?" "It was good." "You sure?" "I think so." He studied me for a second. "What's that supposed to mean?" I hesitated. "The hospital feels quieter." He exhaled softly. "People are under pressure. Healthcare isn't what it was 3 years ago." "I know. They'll adjust." I nodded, but my eyes drifted toward a nearby nurse's station, where 2 employees immediately changed the subject after seeing Daniel. He didn't notice, or maybe he had stopped noticing long ago. As we walked toward the parking garage together, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital was still caring for patients. It had simply stopped feeling safe for the people who cared for them. About a week after returning to work, I received a message asking if I had a few minutes to meet with Richard Lawson, the chairman of the hospital board. Richard had known me since I was a teenager. He'd also known my grandfather long before I was born. His office hadn't changed much over the years. Family photographs still lined one wall, and the old grandfather clock in the corner continued to run 5 minutes fast, something he always joked helped him stay on schedule. When I walked in, he stood and smiled. "It's good to have you back, Emma." "It's good to be back." He waited until the door closed before speaking again. "I've been watching Daniel." I looked at him. "So have I." Richard folded his hands on the desk. "He's under tremendous pressure." "I know. Pressure changes people." "It can." There was a long silence before he reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn leather folder. I'd seen it before. Inside were the original documents my grandfather had signed decades earlier when he established the family trust that had protected the hospital from being sold to outside investors. Richard rested his hand on the folder but didn't open it. "You've had several chances to tell Daniel." "I know. Why haven't you?" I looked through the office window toward the hospital courtyard below. When Daniel met me, I was another physician who happened to argue with him over hospital budgets. Richard smiled. "I remember the story. He fell in love with that woman. And you think knowing the truth would change that?" "I never wanted to find out." Richard nodded slowly. "After my grandfather passed away, his controlling ownership of the hospital transferred into the trust exactly as he'd planned. On paper, I became the majority owner, but almost no one knew it outside the board and a handful of attorneys. I'd never wanted an office with my name on the door. I wanted experienced people leading the hospital while I continued practicing medicine. More than anything, I wanted my marriage to exist without money standing in the middle of it." Richard finally spoke again. "Your grandfather trusted people carefully. So do I. I believe Daniel would eventually prove himself worthy of knowing." "I still believe that." Richard studied me for a moment. "I hope you're right." His words lingered with me long after I left his office. That evening, I watched Daniel standing in our kitchen, reading another report while eating dinner with one hand. I almost told him. Twice, I opened my mouth. Twice, I stopped. He looked up and smiled. "What?" I smiled back. Nothing. It wasn't a lie meant to deceive him. It was a truth I kept postponing because I believed there would always be a better time. Neither of us realized that time had almost run out. The week before the quarterly board review, Daniel barely seemed to leave his office. Every department received another request for updated numbers. Another meeting appeared on everyone's calendar. Another deadline moved closer. When I walked into his office one afternoon, 3 consultants I'd never met were standing around the conference table pointing at graphs projected onto the wall. One of them tapped a chart with a laser pointer. If labor costs don't come down this quarter, the board is going to ask why leadership isn't acting. Daniel nodded without looking away from the screen. What are our options? The consultant flipped to another slide. Department consolidation, position reductions, standardized productivity targets. I listened for another minute before speaking. What about patient wait times? The room went quiet. The consultant answered politely. Those are separate discussions. They're not separate if fewer people are expected to care for the same number of patients. He gave a practiced smile. Our responsibility is operational efficiency. Our responsibility, I replied, is the patient who waits an extra hour because there aren't enough hands to help. Daniel finally looked at me. Emma. I'm not saying we ignore the budget. I know. I'm saying the numbers only tell part of the story. One consultant closed his folder. We'll give you both a few minutes. After they left, Daniel rubbed his temples. I wish you wouldn't challenge these discussions in front of them. I wasn't trying to challenge you. It puts me in a difficult position. I leaned against the edge of his desk. Then let me ask you privately. He nodded. When did we stop asking what these decisions cost people instead of what they save? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the restructuring proposal. The board expects measurable progress. I understand that. If I keep pushing back on every recommendation, they'll think I can't make difficult decisions. I watched him for a moment. You've never been afraid of difficult decisions. No. You've always been afraid of the wrong ones. His expression softened for the briefest moment. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. I have to take this. It was the end of the conversation. That evening we drove home together, but most of the trip passed in silence. Daniel kept replaying tomorrow's executive presentation in his mind. I could almost see it happening behind his eyes. As we pulled into the driveway, he turned off the engine but didn't reach for the door. I need this review to go well. I know. If it doesn't. He stopped. I waited. They'll start questioning whether I'm the right person for this job. I rested my hand on his. I've never doubted that you're the right person. He smiled faintly. I'm not sure everyone else feels the same. I wanted to remind him that leadership wasn't something you proved in a single meeting. Instead, I squeezed his hand once and let the silence sit between us. The next morning, Daniel approved the consultant's restructuring plan without changing a single recommendation. As I read through the final proposal, one sentence caught my attention. Leadership reserves the right to terminate positions that no longer align with organizational priorities. I read it twice. Then, I closed the folder. For the first time since Daniel accepted the promotion, I wasn't worried about the hospital's future. I was worried about his. Monday morning arrived with the kind of silence hospitals usually reserved for operating rooms. The leadership conference room filled early. Department heads lined one side of the table. Physicians, nursing directors, and senior administrators took the remaining seats. No one spoke above a whisper. A copy of the restructuring plan rested in front of every chair. Daniel stood at the front beside a large screen displaying charts and budget projections. He looked composed, professional. If I hadn't known him, I would have believed he had slept well the night before. He moved through the presentation with practiced confidence. Operating costs, efficiency targets, department restructuring, no surprises. Then he paused. The final phase, he said, requires leadership to make decisions that may be personally uncomfortable but are necessary for the long-term health of this hospital. Several people shifted in their seats. Daniel picked up a folder. As part of this restructuring, We've identified positions whose responsibilities no longer align with the direction of the organization. One by one, he listed departments affected by the changes. Then, he looked toward me. For a fraction of a second, I thought he might skip my name. Instead, he met my eyes. Dr. Emma Brooks. The room became very still. I've recommended that your position be eliminated, effective immediately. No one moved. I looked at Daniel, waiting for something that would tell me this was more complicated than it sounded. There was nothing. I spoke evenly. May I ask what standard was used to reach that conclusion? He answered without hesitation. The hospital needs leaders who support organizational priorities instead of resisting necessary change. I questioned one proposal. You questioned the direction. I questioned its impact on patients. He drew a slow breath. Personal opinions cannot outweigh institutional needs. Around the table, no one looked comfortable anymore. A nursing director lowered her eyes. One physician removed his glasses and stared at the table. Daniel continued, "We can't allow emotional decision-making to interfere with responsible leadership." The words landed harder than the termination itself, because they weren't directed at a physician. They were directed at his wife. I realized that everyone in the room understood that. No one interrupted him. No one defended me. Not because they agreed, because they were afraid. I closed the folder in front of me and slipped my notebook into my bag. The sound of the zipper seemed unusually loud. When I stood, Daniel finally looked uncertain. Maybe he expected an argument. Maybe he expected tears. Instead, I looked at him for a long moment. I searched his face for the man who had once spent 3 hours debating hospital budgets because he genuinely wanted to understand my perspective. I couldn't find him, so I turned to the room instead. "Thank you all for the years we've worked together," I said. "I sincerely hope every decision made here continues to place patients first." No one answered. A few people couldn't even look at me. I nodded once, then walked toward the door. Behind me, Daniel called my name. I didn't stop. By the time the elevator doors closed, my phone began vibrating. The caller ID showed only one name, Richard Lawson. The chairman of the board almost never called during business hours. This time, his voice was calm. "Emma." He paused, as though choosing each word carefully. "I need you to come upstairs." His tone told me this wasn't about losing my job. It was about something much bigger that had just begun. Richard was waiting outside the boardroom when I stepped off the elevator. He looked older than he had a week earlier. "I'm sorry," he said. "You don't have to apologize." "I do." He held the door open, but before I walked in, he lowered his voice. What happened downstairs should never have happened. Inside the room, every member of the board was already seated. The conversation stopped when I entered. No one looked surprised to see me. Several looked angry. Richard remained standing. "I've asked everyone here because today's events require immediate attention." A few minutes later, the door opened again. Daniel walked in carrying a folder. He glanced around the room, clearly expecting to discuss the restructuring plan. When he saw me sitting beside Richard, he frowned. I wasn't aware Emma would be attending. Richard gestured toward the empty chair opposite the table. "Please have a seat." Daniel did, though his expression suggested he was trying to understand why the atmosphere felt so different from the meeting he'd just left. Richard folded his hands. "Before we discuss this morning's termination, there's information you should have received long ago." Daniel looked from Richard to me. "What information?" Richard opened the worn leather folder that had rested in his office for years. Inside were copies of the founding trust, signed decades earlier by Emma's grandfather. He slid the first document across the table. "This hospital has remained independent because its majority ownership has been protected by a confidential family trust." Daniel nodded politely. "I know the history." "What you don't know," Richard said, "is who inherited that trust." The room fell silent. Richard turned toward me. "Emma Brooks became the majority owner upon her grandfather's passing. She has remained the controlling owner ever since." Daniel didn't move. For several seconds, he simply stared at the document. Then he looked at me. "No." His voice barely carried across the table. "You own the hospital?" I met his eyes. I never wanted ownership to define our marriage. He blinked several times, trying to catch up with what he'd heard. You never told me. I wanted you to choose me without that knowledge. I did choose you. I know. The words didn't comfort either of us. Daniel looked back at Richard. Why wasn't I informed when I accepted this position? Because Emma specifically asked us to honor her privacy, Richard answered. The board respected that decision. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his face drained of color. Everything from the past 3 years seemed to rearrange itself behind his eyes. The debates at the kitchen table, Emma's questions during planning meetings, her insistence on protecting patient care. None of it had come from a physician speaking outside her field. It had come from the person carrying the greatest responsibility for the hospital's future. Richard broke the silence. Let's be clear, this meeting is not about ownership. He paused. It's about leadership. No one argued. Richard continued. This morning, Dr. Emma Brooks was publicly dismissed by her own husband without consultation with the board, without due process, and in direct violation of hospital policy. Daniel lowered his head. For the first time since accepting the promotion, he had nothing to defend. Richard looked toward me. As majority owner, you have the authority to request Mr. Brooks's immediate removal pending formal review. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. I could feel Daniel waiting for my answer. I drew a slow breath. No. Several board members exchanged surprised glances. This isn't the moment to make decisions out of anger, I said. Whatever happens next should happen because it's right for the hospital, not because of what happened between us this morning. Richard studied me for a moment before nodding. Then that's how we'll proceed. Daniel finally looked up. There was gratitude in his expression, but it was buried beneath something much heavier. For the first time since I'd met him 3 years earlier, he wasn't looking at me as his wife. He was looking at the woman he had failed to recognize long before he ever learned she owned the hospital. By the following morning, the hospital had returned to its usual routine. Patients checked in, doctors made rounds, nurses hurried from room to room. From a distance, nothing looked different, but hospitals have a way of carrying news faster than almost any place I've ever known. No one was talking about budgets anymore. They were talking about the meeting. More specifically, they were talking about Daniel. As I walked through the lobby, people greeted me the same way they always had. Some smiled. Others simply nodded. A few started to say something, then thought better of it. Not one person asked about the ownership announcement. Instead, one respiratory therapist stopped beside me. I'm sorry, she said softly. She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't have to. Upstairs, the board had placed Daniel under an administrative leadership review. He would remain in his position temporarily, but every major decision now required board approval until the investigation was complete. It wasn't a punishment. It was a safeguard. Late that afternoon, I saw Daniel crossing the main corridor. For years, employees had naturally drifted toward him. Someone would ask a question. Another would stop to share an idea. There was always conversation. This time, people stepped aside to let him pass. They were polite, respectful, but there was distance where familiarity had once lived. Daniel noticed it too. He slowed near the nurse's station, smiled at a veteran charge nurse and asked, "How's your unit holding up?" "We're managing," she answered. Nothing more. She returned to her chart before the conversation had a chance to become one. Daniel stood there for another second, then continued walking. Watching from the opposite hallway, I realized something painful. The authority he still carried hadn't disappeared. The trust had. Over the next several days, I spent more time listening than speaking. I visited departments without announcing myself. I asked nurses what had changed. I asked residents what made them hesitate during meetings. I asked housekeeping staff whether they still felt comfortable raising concerns. The answers weren't dramatic. They were remarkably similar. We stopped speaking up. People worry about saying the wrong thing. It feels like every conversation is being graded. No one described Daniel as cruel. No one questioned his intelligence. Most still believed he wanted the hospital to succeed. They simply no longer believed there was room for disagreement. One afternoon, I found an anonymous suggestion box outside the employee cafeteria. It was overflowing, not with complaints, with ideas, suggestions that no one had felt safe enough to say out loud. I carried the stack back to my temporary office and spent hours reading every page. There were proposals to improve patient flow, ideas for mentoring younger nurses, ways to reduce burnout without cutting staff. The hospital hadn't run out of good people. It had run out of conversations. That evening, before leaving, I looked through the glass wall overlooking the parking lot. Daniel was sitting alone in his car. The engine wasn't running. His hands rested on the steering wheel, but he didn't move. For the first time since this had all begun, he didn't look like an executive trying to solve a problem. He looked like a husband who had finally realized the hardest thing he'd lost wasn't waiting for him at home. It had started slipping away long before either of us admitted it. Daniel didn't come home until after 10 that night. I heard the front door open while I was reading in the living room. He paused when he saw the light was still on. "I didn't think you'd be awake." I couldn't sleep. He nodded once, set his keys on the table, and started toward the kitchen. There was a time when one of us would have followed the other without thinking. This time, neither of us moved. "I've been staying late," he said after a while. "I know. It's easier than coming home." I closed the book on my lap. "Why?" He let out a slow breath. "Because work used to be the place where I knew what I was doing." The honesty caught me off guard. For months, every conversation between us had ended before it reached anything real. Now he looked exhausted enough to stop pretending. "The board gave me copies of my old leadership evaluations today," he said. "One of them mentioned that I listened before making difficult decisions." He gave a quiet, humorless laugh. I barely recognized the person they were describing. He disappeared into the study and came back carrying a small box. "I found these." Inside were old notebooks, photographs, and folded pieces of paper. One by one, he placed them on the coffee table. A picture from our honeymoon. A grocery list with a smiley face I'd drawn beside pancake mix. The note I'd tucked into his briefcase before one of his final interviews. "You've never needed to become someone else to succeed. The right opportunity will recognize the man you already are." Daniel stared at the note for several seconds. I carried this every day. I remember writing it. I stopped reading it. The room fell quiet again. Not awkward, just honest. He looked at me for the first time that evening. "I keep thinking the worst thing I did was fire you." I waited. "It wasn't." His voice dropped. "The worst thing was that I stopped treating you like the person whose opinion mattered most." I didn't answer immediately. Outside, headlights swept across the front window before disappearing down the street. "When I questioned your decisions," I said, "I wasn't trying to embarrass you. I know that now. You used to ask what I thought before every big decision." "I remember." "Then one day you stopped asking." He lowered his eyes. "I thought I had to prove I could lead on my own." "And did you?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. After a long silence, he looked back at me. "I'm sorry, Emma." There was no speech, no attempt to explain away what had happened. Only 2 words spoken by a man who finally understood they weren't enough to repair what had been broken. I appreciated the apology. I wasn't ready to accept it. "I believe you're sorry," I said gently. "But trust doesn't come back because someone finally finds the right words." He nodded. "I know." For the first time in months, we had said the things we'd spent so long avoiding. It hurt, but it also felt strangely unfamiliar, not because we were fighting, because we were finally telling each other the truth. The following Monday, I attended my first leadership meeting since the board had asked me to help oversee the hospital's transition. Nothing about the room had changed. The same polished conference table, the same projector humming softly, the same people sitting in the same chairs. Only the atmosphere was different. No one rushed to begin. Several department heads kept glancing toward Daniel before looking back at their notes. He sat halfway down the table instead of at the front. That wasn't the board's decision. It was his. When everyone had settled, I looked around the room. "I've spent the last week meeting with people across the hospital," I said. "I heard concerns, but I also heard good ideas. I'd like today to be different." No one spoke immediately. Then one of the nursing directors cleared her throat. Different how? If you disagree with a proposal, I want to hear it. She hesitated. And if we're wrong, then we'll discuss why. And if we're right, we'll change the proposal. A few people exchanged uncertain smiles. It sounded simple. Apparently, it hadn't felt possible for a long time. The first suggestion came from a young emergency department physician. He nervously explained that one staffing reduction would likely increase patient wait times during overnight shifts. Halfway through his explanation, he stopped. I'm sorry, I don't mean to challenge leadership. You aren't challenging leadership, I replied. You're helping it. He finished speaking. Another department head offered a different perspective. Within minutes, the room was doing something it hadn't done in months. People were talking to one another instead of trying to avoid saying the wrong thing. Daniel remained quiet through most of the meeting. He took notes. He listened. Twice, someone disagreed with one of his earlier recommendations. Neither time did he interrupt. When the meeting ended, several employees lingered behind, continuing conversations that normally would have ended the moment the agenda was finished. As everyone filed out, Daniel stayed where he was. I used to think meetings like that meant I'd lost control, he said. I gathered my folders. And now? I think I was confusing agreement with trust. Neither of us smiled. There wasn't much to celebrate yet. Before leaving, Daniel walked back to the head of the conference table, where he'd spent so many months directing conversations. He rested his hand on the empty chair for a moment, then looked across the room. I wanted that seat because I thought leadership lived there. He glanced toward the doorway, where employees were still talking freely in the hallway. It never did. I didn't answer. He had reached that conclusion on his own. As we left the conference room together, I noticed something I hadn't seen in a very long time. A resident physician stopped Daniel in the hallway, not because he had to, because he wanted to ask for his opinion. Daniel listened without checking his phone, without looking over the resident's shoulder, without trying to end the conversation. It lasted less than 2 minutes. But as I watched them walk away in opposite directions, I realized rebuilding trust didn't begin with a board decision or a new policy. It began with moments so ordinary that most people would never think to remember them. This time, I did. The board's review lasted 3 weeks. No one rushed it. They interviewed department heads, nurses, physicians, administrative staff, and people who had worked beside Daniel long before he became an executive. When the final meeting arrived, the boardroom felt different from the last time we'd all gathered there. Less tense, more honest. Daniel entered carrying nothing except a legal pad. He didn't bring reports. He didn't bring charts. He didn't even bring prepared remarks. Richard Lawson looked around the room before speaking. We've completed our review. No one interrupted. The findings are consistent. He paused briefly. Mr. Brooks demonstrated competence, dedication, and a genuine commitment to the hospital's long-term stability. However, he also created a leadership culture where disagreement became increasingly difficult, communication narrowed, and fear gradually replaced trust. Daniel lowered his eyes. Richard continued. The public dismissal of Dr. Emma Brooks reflected not a failure of knowledge, but a failure of judgment. The words settled over the room without anyone arguing. Daniel looked up. I agree. Several board members glanced at one another. Richard folded his hands. Would you like to respond? Yes. Daniel stood. For a moment, he seemed to search for the right place to begin. I've spent most of my career believing that admitting mistakes would make people lose confidence in me. He looked around the table. I've learned the opposite. No one spoke. I stopped listening because I became afraid that uncertainty would look like weakness. His voice remained steady. I confused control with leadership. I confused efficiency with effectiveness. And somewhere along the way, I stopped hearing the people who were trying to help me most. His eyes found mine for only a second before returning to the board. What happened in that conference room was my responsibility alone. He didn't mention pressure. He didn't mention consultants. He didn't mention the board's expectations. There were no excuses left to offer. I'll accept whatever decision you make. Richard nodded once. Thank you. The board recessed for a private vote. As everyone stood, one member remained behind. She looked at me. "Emma, as majority owner, you have every legal right to participate. I know you've chosen not to, because this decision belongs to the board." She studied me for a moment. "Even after everything?" I glanced through the glass wall where Daniel stood alone at the end of the hallway, staring out toward the city. "This hospital deserves fairness." She gave a small nod before joining the others. An hour later, the board returned. Richard addressed the room. "Mr. Brooks will step down from his current executive role effective immediately." Daniel didn't react. "The board is also offering you a newly created position reporting directly to hospital leadership. Your responsibilities will focus on operational improvement, staff collaboration, and rebuilding organizational trust." The room remained silent. It wasn't a promotion. It wasn't a humiliation either. It was an opportunity to earn back what titles alone had never been able to give him. Daniel answered without hesitation, "I accept." As the meeting ended, he walked toward the door. Before leaving, he stopped beside me. "I don't expect forgiveness because the board gave me another chance." I looked at him. "I know. I only hope I become someone worthy of it again." This time, neither of us tried to say anything more. Some conversations aren't meant to end with perfect words. They're meant to continue through the choices people make afterward. The first counseling appointment felt more uncomfortable than the board meeting. Neither of us knew where to sit. The counselor noticed. "You can choose any chairs you'd like." Daniel looked at me. "You decide." It was such a small thing. Months earlier, he probably would have chosen without thinking. Now, he waited. I sat down. He took the chair beside me. Not too close. Not far away either. The counselor didn't ask about the hospital first. She asked something simpler. "When was the last time the two of you enjoyed being together?" Neither of us answered immediately. Daniel finally smiled to himself. "There was a bookstore near the river." I looked over at him. "You always wandered into the history section, and you always disappeared into medical biographies. You complained they were too serious." They were. A quiet laugh escaped both of us. It faded quickly, but it was real. The counselor nodded. "Notice what happened." Daniel looked confused. "What do you mean?" For 10 seconds, neither of you talked about the problem. You remembered the relationship. That stayed with me. Healing didn't begin because we solved everything. It began because we remembered there had once been something worth saving. Over the next few months, nothing changed overnight. Daniel left his phone on the kitchen counter during dinner. The first few evenings, he reached for it almost automatically. Then he'd catch himself and pull his hand back. He started coming home when he said he would. If a meeting ran late, he called before I wondered where he was. Not because I demanded it, because he wanted me to stop guessing. On Saturday mornings, we began walking along the Chicago River again. Sometimes we talked for an hour. Sometimes we barely spoke at all. The silence no longer felt like avoidance. It felt peaceful. One afternoon, we found ourselves standing outside the little cafe where we'd had our first 3-hour conversation. Daniel looked at the window and smiled. "I lost that budget argument." "You did?" "I still think I had some good points." "You had a few." He laughed. "I married the only woman who can admit I'm partially right without giving me the victory. I didn't want you getting overconfident." We went inside. The owner recognized us immediately. "Haven't seen you two in a while." Daniel glanced at me before answering. "We've been finding our way back." The words were simple. They were also true. That evening, after we arrived home, Daniel disappeared into the bedroom for a minute and returned carrying a small wooden box. Inside lay our wedding vows. He unfolded his copy carefully. "I've read these a dozen times since everything happened." "So have I." He looked at the page, then quietly closed it again. "I used to think this promise was about staying married." He tapped one line with his finger. "I never want success to change the man you fell in love with. I understand it differently now." I waited. That promise wasn't about success. He looked at me with the same openness I'd seen years earlier over coffee. It was about paying attention. I reached across the table and took his hand, not because everything had been repaired, not because trust had fully returned, because for the first time in a long time, his actions had begun matching the man who had spoken those vows. That was enough for one evening, and after everything we'd been through, one honest evening felt like a beginning. Months passed. The hospital found its rhythm again, not because people forgot what had happened, because they decided to learn from it. The anonymous suggestion box outside the cafeteria never disappeared. Every month, department leaders met with nurses, physicians, technicians, and support staff to discuss ideas before making major decisions. The conversations weren't always easy. They were honest. Daniel settled into his new role without complaint. The title on his office door was smaller than before, but he never mentioned it. Instead, he spent his days walking through departments, asking questions, and staying long enough to hear the answers. Sometimes someone disagreed with him. He thanked them. The first few times, people looked surprised. Eventually, they stopped being surprised. One afternoon, a young administrator admitted she'd been nervous about presenting a proposal. Daniel smiled. "I know the feeling." "You do?" "I used to think I had to have every answer before I walked into a room." "And now?" "Now I try to leave with better questions." She nodded thoughtfully and continued her presentation. Watching from the back of the room, I realized trust wasn't returning because people had been instructed to trust him. It was returning because he had stopped asking for it and started earning it. A few weeks later, Richard announced his retirement. At the small reception held in the hospital atrium, he stood beside me, looking across the crowd. "Do you know what people still talk about?" he asked. "The meeting." He nodded. I thought they'd remember it because the owner turned out to be the physician everyone already knew. "They don't." "No." He smiled gently. "They remember it because it forced everyone here to ask what kind of leaders they wanted to become." Across the room, Daniel was laughing with a maintenance supervisor about a broken coffee machine. 3 years earlier, that would have seemed perfectly ordinary. Somehow, seeing it again meant more now. When the reception ended, Daniel found me near the front entrance. "You ready?" "I am." We walked toward the parking garage together, neither of us in a hurry. The evening air carried the familiar sounds of downtown Chicago. Traffic moved steadily beyond the hospital grounds, and the city continued exactly as it always had. Halfway to the car, Daniel reached for my hand. Not dramatically, not as an apology, simply because it felt natural again. I looked at our hands for a moment before looking up at him. "You know," I said, "people still think this story is about the day you fired your wife." He let out a quiet breath. "I know." I smiled. "I don't." He glanced at me. "I think it's about two people who almost forgot why they chose each other in the first place." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure we never forget again." We kept walking. No audience, no speeches, no celebration waiting at the end of the day. Just two people leaving work together, carrying the lessons they'd paid dearly to learn. Looking back, that unforgettable meeting was never the moment that defined our marriage. It was the moment that exposed everything we had stopped protecting. The marriage survived because we finally understood something neither of us had fully appreciated when we stood at the altar 3 years earlier. Love may bring two people together, but it's respect, shown in ordinary conversations, careful listening, and the choice to value one another every single day, that gives them a reason to keep walking in the same direction.